So let me continue with the reasons why we study ecology. Um, we are increasingly aware of the interdependence between people and our civilization and nature. So we use these, which is vital for food production, maintaining of the clean air and water, and overall in sustaining biodiversity. So especially in this changing climate. So ecology certainly provides a lot of knowledge on the how to improve these interdependence and how to avoid the problems we encounter with increasing changes in our world. And finally, ecology also serves as the scientific basis for conserving species and habitats. And as you all know, we are in the midst of a biodiversity crisis, which has also implications on our future as a humankind. Okay, so but there are more specific questions that ecologists might ask, and here are some of these right here. For example, what is the role of increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in the regulation of global temperature? So this is at the biosphere level, rather. Or as a you can also ask, for example, how the diversity or the distribution of certain groups of species are influenced by the past, the geological past. Biogeographers usually ask these questions, but which is also connected with ecology as well. Or at the landscape scale, which is you can consider this as if it's made up of different ecosystems altogether in a particular region. We may ask, for example, corridors with particular vegetation, how do they help or hinder the movements of organisms through these corridors? Because as we know, we are increasingly fragmenting, dividing the natural environment into patches, and it is important to know what the impact of this is. Or we may wonder, how does an ecosystem respond to fire, especially in terms of, let's say, nutrient availability. Also, we may ask things like whether disturbances, even maybe tourism itself, safaris, for example, photographing safaris, how do they influence the distribution of mammals or the number of mammal species in a particular area? What does a zebra gain as a benefit from allowing the oxpecker, which is actually, as you can see, is a small bird, which helps the animal to get rid of its parasites, and how does it benefit evolutionarily? Or if you're studying again zebra numbers, population, the numbers may go up and down, and you may wonder what makes these ups and downs. Is there a cyclic thing, or is it just random? And so on and so forth. A classical study actually was carried out more than 50 years ago, and this was made by Robert MacArthur, who was an influential ecologist who died early. This is quite classical in the sense that because it involved both the field work, it involved a group that everybody is familiar with, birds, and also it had a theoretical basis as well. So this guy studied the ecology of 5 different species of warblers in North America in spruce forest. Spruce is a conifer tree, and this was interesting because normally, as a rule, theoretically, you don't expect organisms, different species, that feed on, let's say, on the same insects, that have the same requirements of habitat, because they would be in really strong competition, and usually one would replace the other. But here we had not 2, not 3, but 5 species living actually in the same forest, living on the same individual trees, and yet not apparently pushing one another away. So MacArthur wanted to find out what makes them able to exist together, to coexist. Just a few pictures of these birds. These are, of course, all drawings or paintings, like this warbler, another warbler, nice, very colorful warblers. And all of these actually had, they ate the same kind of insects, etc. And they were all migratory birds. They would migrate down south in winter. What MacArthur did was he went into the field and he started observing each of these different species, several individuals of them in succession, one after the other. And actually, he timed how much time they spent on the tree itself during feeding. And what he found was that actually each warbler species had different feeding zones. For example, Cape May warbler actually spent most of its time up in the top of a tree, eating insects around the needles. Another one just spent time in the middle, or this one particular one spent time inside, near the bole, near the trunk, where there was maybe lichen covered branches and so on. And the fifth one spent a lot of time in the lower branches. So it seems that these 5 species avoided competition by simply dividing the zones they had spent time on. So this is a good study about competition, and it also provided how resources are partitioned in nature. More recently, of course, we are more interested in, for example, on the impact of climate change on ecosystems, and this usually requires either very long-term observations, but usually we don't have enough time to be able to understand how ecosystem change in response to climate change, or instead we can carry out certain experiments like the setup here. So these transparent containers, if you like, with an open top, they simulate increased temperatures. Each of these usually increase the temperature about 2 degrees or 2.5 degrees, which is very similar to what is expected in about 50 or 60 years time. So here we can try to observe how things will change. As you can guess, this is actually somewhere not in Turkey, in further north. Unfortunately, we don't have yet any experiments of this kind, which we should start soon. Or you can actually, instead of trying to predict the future by doing experiments, you can look back into the past. There's a branch called paleoecology, which means simply looking at the history of vegetation. And usually this involves looking at pollen, because through the millennia and centuries, pollen produced by these trees go airborne and then fall into a lake. And then right at the bottom, you will have these sediments, one on top of the other. So if you take a sediment core like this, and it would actually reflect, every millimeter maybe will be just 10 or 20 years. So when you take a 1 meter deep core, it would probably represent thousands of years. And you can tell how the environment and the vegetation change over time by looking at this pollen. And looking into the past actually also helps us to predict the future. But there is a lot of challenge that involves ecology. I have to admit this. The first one is this. Now, the systems we study are infinitely more varied, diverse, and complex than, for example, most chemists or physicists study. They study a much more simpler system that involves a few molecules maybe. Now, our systems involve usually several species, up to maybe hundreds of them, and lots of interactions between them, which complicates things even further. So being able to tell or tease apart the system in a way we can easily understand its workings is not easy. So another thing is that this makes it difficult to discover universal laws in ecology. And we cannot always make very confident predictions. In the past, this actually produced some kind of disregard, let's say, with ecology as a science. But because people usually expect some predicted work, so I'm going to say in 5 years' time, this particular Sea of Marmara will have a production of this much and then a pollution rate of this much. We cannot tell that easily. But now we are increasingly seeing the complexity of the living world, and also we understand how the environment is changing it, and how our own economies and livelihoods and even life support systems are being influenced. So now ecologists are being listened to more often now. Another issue that makes it a little bit difficult for ecology and ecologists to be certain of the to have predictive power is that what we call emergent properties. Now, so if there is a system is made up of several different parts, and if you understand what each part is doing, then you can probably predict what the whole system is doing. But actually in ecology, this is not always the case, because to put it in a simpler way, the whole is actually more than the sum of its parts. So the small parts you may understand how they work, but when they come together, a new property emerges, which is not possible to predict beforehand. Our brain is also like this. Now, we know how individual nerve cells, neurons, work, but we certainly don't understand how, when they come together, they have feelings, or they have understanding of the world, or they can produce music. We simply don't know this. These are examples of emergent properties. Similarly, in ecology, we have lots of cases where emergent properties exist and emerge. So this is common in ecological sciences. And unlike other natural sciences like physics and chemistry, we cannot have a reductionist approach here. We have to have usually what we call a black box approach. We may not know what is inside, how it's working, but we may need to observe the whole and also see what the emergent properties are doing. Okay, so this first two short videos are for you to just get used to the idea of ecology, to know about how it came today. And in the next few days, I will be also sending you links with the first lectures that specifically focus on population ecology. So I finished this lecture with, I think, with one more slide. It just telling you that there's a wide variety of approaches in ecology, but many of them usually take many years. It's not just straightforward. You go into a lab and then come out with something in a few weeks. And it also requires studying on large areas most often time. So our work is usually field work, which is based on observations, although increasingly large-scale experiments are being carried out. There are also few cases of lab experiments, but they are on the minority. So I finished this with a nice picture of Lake Amir, which is actually one of our